In 1934, on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, a Lakota woman named Mary Hollow Hornbear was raising 6 children on land the federal government had already taken twice. The first time, in 1889, when the Great Sioux Reservation was broken up and sold to white settlers, 60% of the land gone overnight by an act of Congress. The second time, through the Dawes Allotment Act, which gave each Native family 160 acres and sold the rest as surplus. Mary's family had no bank account, no mortgage, no credit history, because between 1991 and 1996, only 91 conventional mortgage loans were made to Native American borrowers on tribal lands across the entire United States. That is fewer than 20 families per year in the whole country able to buy a new home. Mary had none of that. What she had was something the federal government spent 150 years trying to take away and never fully could. A set of survival practices so precise, so elegant, and so effective that her family ate every single day, while the system around her was specifically designed to make that impossible. Her neighbors called it poverty. Economists today call it one of the most sophisticated informal economies ever documented on American soil. Subscribe. Here are 25 forgotten penny-pinching secrets that Native American reservation families used to survive a system built against them. Secret 25. The Three Sisters, a financial system disguised as farming. Long before European contact, Native American agricultural communities across the continent grew corn, beans, and squash together in the same plot. Not because it looked nice, because the system was financially and biologically perfect. Corn grew tall and drew nitrogen from the soil. Beans climbed the corn stalks and replenished that nitrogen. Squash spread low across the ground, shading the soil to retain moisture and suppress weeds. 3 crops, 1 plot, 0 waste, 0 inputs. The system produced a complete, nutritionally balanced diet, carbohydrates, protein, and vitamins, from land that required no fertilizer, no pesticide, and no purchased seed, as long as families saved seeds from the best plants each year. When the federal government moved tribes onto reservations and cut off traditional hunting grounds, those families who maintained the Three Sisters Garden had a foundation that required almost nothing from the outside economy. The system was 5,000 years old. It worked better than anything the Department of Agriculture was recommending at the time. Secret 24. Pemmican, the original energy bar that lasted 2 years without refrigeration. The Great Plains tribes developed pemmican as a survival technology that modern food scientists still study with genuine admiration. Dried buffalo meat was ground to a powder, mixed with rendered fat and dried berries, then packed tightly into hide bags. The result was a dense, calorie-rich food that kept for up to 2 years without any refrigeration, without any preservatives, and without any cost beyond the labor of preparation. A single pound of pemmican contained the caloric equivalent of 4 to 5 pounds of fresh meat. Lakota warriors carried it on long journeys. Families stored it through winter. When the federal government slaughtered an estimated 30 to 60 million buffalo between 1870 and 1890, reducing the herds to fewer than 1,000 animals, they were not just eliminating a food source. They were deliberately destroying the raw material of the most sophisticated food preservation system on the continent. Secret 23. Use every part of the animal. 0 goes to waste. When a Lakota family processed a buffalo, nothing was discarded. The meat was eaten fresh, dried into jerky, or made into pemmican. The hide became clothing, blankets, and teepee covers. The bones were boiled for marrow, one of the most calorie-dense foods available, and then cracked and boiled again to extract every last gram of fat for cooking. Sinew became thread and bowstrings. The stomach became a cooking vessel. The bladder became a water container. The tongue was a delicacy. The organs were eaten immediately after the kill as the most nutritious part of the animal. Hooves were boiled into glue. Buffalo chips, dried dung, were used as fuel on the treeless plains where wood was scarce. A single buffalo, processed correctly by a family that knew what it was doing, provided food, shelter, tools, clothing, and fuel. Modern food waste statistics estimate that Americans throw away between 30 and 40% of their food supply every year. A Lakota family processing a buffalo wasted 0%, not as a philosophy, as a practice. Secret 22. Underground food storage, cold preservation without electricity. Across Native America, from the Earth Lodge tribes of the Great Plains to the Pueblo peoples of the Southwest, underground storage was the standard technology for keeping food through winter and through droughts. Earth Lodge tribes like the Arikara, Hidatsa, and Mandan dug underground storage caches beneath their lodges. These chambers, insulated by several feet of earth, maintained temperatures close to 40 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, the same temperature as a modern refrigerator, without a single watt of electricity. Corn, squash, dried meat, and dried berries were packed in ceramic vessels or hide containers and sealed underground. A well-stocked cache from a good harvest could feed a family of 5 through 8 months of plains winter. When the federal government confined these tribes to reservations and their hunting ranges shrank, the families who still maintained these storage systems had a buffer against crop failure and supply disruption that those without them did not. Secret 21. Seed saving. The original seed bank, zero cost. Every traditional Native American farming community saved seeds, not as a hobby, as the foundational act of food sovereignty. At the end of each growing season, the best ears of corn, the largest, most disease-resistant, most productive, were set aside not for eating, but for planting. The best squash, the strongest beans. These saved seeds, selected over hundreds of generations, were adapted to local soil conditions, local rainfall patterns, and local climate in ways that no commercial seed variety could match. When the federal government's commodity food program began distributing processed flour, lard, and canned meat to reservation families, foods completely foreign to traditional diets, the families who maintained seed saving maintained the ability to grow their own food, regardless of what the government chose to distribute. Seed saving cost nothing. It required only knowledge and discipline, and it was specifically targeted for destruction by boarding school policies that removed children from their communities and prevented the intergenerational transfer of exactly this kind of knowledge. Secret 20. The gift economy, sharing as financial infrastructure. The Lakota concept of Wathapi, communal feasting and sharing, was not charity. It was infrastructure. When a hunter returned with more meat than his family could eat, the surplus was distributed to elders, to families with young children, to those who were sick or grieving. The expectation was not repayment. It was reciprocity. The hunter who gave generously today was the hunter whose family would be fed when he was injured or when the hunt failed. This system, which economists call a gift economy or a redistributive economy, meant that a single family on Pine Ridge Reservation in 1920 might survive a bad year, not because they had savings in a bank, but because they were embedded in a network of relationships that guaranteed they would not go hungry as long as anyone in the network had food. Between 1991 and 1996, only 91 conventional mortgage loans were made to Native American borrowers on tribal lands nationwide. The banking system had essentially excluded Native families from formal financial infrastructure. The gift economy was the alternative financial infrastructure, and it had been operating for thousands of years before the first bank ever opened on American soil. Secret 19. Fry bread, survival food made from government rations. Fry bread is today eaten at powwows across the country and described in tourist literature as traditional Native cuisine. It is not. It was invented out of desperation. When the federal government forced the Diné, the Navajo, on the Long Walk in 1864, relocating them from their ancestral lands in Arizona to Bosque Redondo in New Mexico, they were given government rations: white flour, lard, salt, sugar, and baking powder, ingredients with which they had no culinary tradition and which bore no relation to their diet of corn, squash, beans, and game. From these rations, Navajo women invented fry bread, flat dough fried in lard, as the most calorie-efficient thing they could make from the limited supplies provided. It fed children. It fed elders. It fed a people who had lost everything and been given almost nothing in return. Fry bread is not a recipe. It is a monument to the ingenuity of women who refused to let their families starve with what the government handed them. Secret 18. Traditional medicine from the land, zero pharmaceutical costs. Every native nation across the continent had a sophisticated pharmacopoeia of medicinal plants, roots, and preparations that served as the primary healthcare system for centuries. Cherokee healers used golden seal as an antibiotic and digestive aid. Lakota medicine, people used yarrow to stop bleeding. Navajo practitioners used juniper bark tea for arthritis. Willow bark, the original source of aspirin, was used by dozens of nations for pain and fever long before Bayer patented the synthetic version in 1899. This medical knowledge, accumulated over thousands of years of observation and practice, cost nothing to use once learned. On reservations where the nearest Indian Health Service facility might be 100 miles away, and where, as recently as 2016, residents on Pine Ridge drove 48 kilometers to reach the nearest town for emergency care, this knowledge was not historical curiosity. It was survival. Secret 17, water knowledge, finding it, moving it, preserving it. Thousands of native households on reservations still lack reliable running water. This is not new. It has been the condition of many reservation communities since confinement. The response, from traditional knowledge, was mastery of water sourcing, movement, and conservation. Pueblo peoples of the Southwest developed irrigation systems so sophisticated that modern engineers study them. The Hohokam of Arizona built over 1,000 miles of irrigation canals, some of them 30 feet wide, that fed farming communities for centuries without a single machine. On the northern plains, families knew exactly where springs emerged, where groundwater was accessible, and how to line clay containers to prevent evaporation during the dry months. When the federal government failed to provide water infrastructure on reservations, as it did and continues to do, the families with traditional water knowledge were the families that kept their gardens alive. Secret 16. Trade networks. Commerce without cash. Before European contact, Native American trade networks extended across the entire continent. Obsidian from Wyoming was found in burial sites in Ohio. Copper from the Great Lakes appeared in artifacts from the Gulf Coast. Shells from the Pacific Ocean traveled to communities in the Rocky Mountains. These networks continued in modified form into the reservation era. Families with a surplus of one commodity, dried corn, tanned hides, beadwork, traded it for something they lacked, entirely outside the cash economy. On reservations where cash was chronically scarce because unemployment exceeded 50% in some communities and where the banking system had effectively redlined the entire reservation, this trade economy was not archaic. It was the functioning alternative to a formal market that had excluded native families by design. Secret 15. Multi-generational households, shared costs, shared survival. Overcrowding on reservations is documented in every federal study conducted since the 19th century. Multiple families in a single family home, 3 generations under one roof. What housing policy documents as a crisis, reservation families transformed into a financial survival strategy. Grandparents provided child care, freeing parents to work. Elders passed traditional knowledge to grandchildren directly. Cooking for 8 people costs less per person than cooking for 2. Heating one home for 15 people costs a fraction of heating 5 homes for 3 people each. The multi-generational household on a Native American reservation was simultaneously the result of housing scarcity and the response to it, a forced arrangement that families learned to leverage as a collective resource-sharing system. Secret 14. Hunting and fishing as financial strategy, not recreation. On reservations where commodity food rations were nutritionally inadequate and chronically insufficient, the government never provided enough food to feed all tribal members. As documented by the National Indian Council on Aging, hunting and fishing were not weekend hobbies. They were the difference between protein deficiency and adequate nutrition. Families who maintained hunting skills, who knew the local terrain, who had preserved the knowledge of where deer moved in the fall and where fish ran in spring, ate better than families who depended entirely on government commodities. This knowledge was specifically targeted for elimination. Federal policies outlawed traditional hunting practices on many reservations. Boarding schools removed children from the communities where this knowledge was transmitted. The families who preserved it anyway, who hunted quietly, who taught children in private, had access to food that cost nothing but skill and time. Secret 13. Beadwork, weaving, and crafts as income. Beauty as economic survival. Navajo weaving is, today, sold in galleries for thousands of dollars per rug. A century ago, Navajo women wove for survival. Beadwork, pottery, basketry, silversmithing, carving. Across every native nation, the transformation of natural materials into objects of beauty was simultaneously an artistic tradition and an economic strategy. On a reservation where formal employment was scarce and banking access was denied, craft production was one of the few ways a family could generate cash income outside the formal economy. A Navajo rug, traded or sold at the nearest town, provided money for things the family could not produce itself. A Lakota woman's beadwork could be exchanged for food, for tools, for school supplies for children. These skills, passed from grandmother to granddaughter, from elder to apprentice, were economic assets as real as any bank account. And unlike a bank account, they could not be seized, foreclosed upon, or devalued by government policy. Secret 12. Fire management. Heat and cooking without cost. On the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, temperatures dropped to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit in winter. Heating a home under those conditions is not optional. For families without income to pay fuel bills, traditional fire management, knowing which wood burned longest, how to build a fire that produced maximum heat with minimum fuel, how to bank coals overnight to keep a home warm without burning continuously, was survival knowledge. Volunteers from Global Volunteers travel annually to Rosebud Reservation to help chop and store firewood for distribution during winter months, specifically because firewood scarcity is a life-threatening reality for reservation families with no income to buy propane or heating oil. Families who knew how to find, cut, split, season, and efficiently burn wood had a heating system that cost only labor. Families who did not know how, whose traditional knowledge had been disrupted by boarding schools or relocation policies, depended on systems they could not afford. Secret 11. Community gardens, collective production, individual survival. The food sovereignty movement on reservations today, community gardens, seed banks, collective farming programs, is not an innovation. It is a return. Families on the Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota have organized small local farmers to collectively sell produce to meet institutional demand from schools and stores. Running Strong's organic gardens and food programs provide seeds, tools, and training to restore what was systematically destroyed. The Lakota vision that food is medicine, that the community's health and the community's food supply are inseparable, is documented in the Rosebud Food Sovereignty Initiative, which states explicitly, food will again be seen as medicine that heals the body, mind, and spirit of the Oyate. This was not a new idea in 2020. It was a very old idea being remembered. Secret 10. Moccasins and traditional clothing, making what you cannot buy. On reservations where per capita income in some communities was under $8,000 per year, and where the nearest town might be 50 miles away, buying new clothes for 6 children was not possible. Making them was. Traditional clothing construction, tanning hides, cutting patterns, stitching by hand, was a practical skill with immediate financial value. A woman who could tan a deer hide and sew it into moccasins that lasted through a plains winter saved money that did not exist. Children's clothing repaired, let out, passed down, remade from other garments. Nothing new purchased until nothing else was possible. The boarding school system specifically targeted this knowledge, forcing Native children into manufactured Western clothing and outlawing traditional dress. The families who preserved the skills anyway had a manufacturing capacity inside their homes that required nothing from the outside economy. Secret 9. Drying, smoking, and fermenting. Preservation without power. Native American food preservation technology was sophisticated enough that families could store a season's harvest through an entire year without electricity, without refrigeration, and without any purchased preservative. Meat was dried in thin strips over racks in the sun and wind, the process that produces jerky, or smoked over low fires with specific woods chosen for the flavor and antimicrobial properties of their smoke. Fish was split and dried on racks. Corn was dried and stored in sealed ceramic vessels. Berries were dried into cakes. In the Arctic and subarctic, fermentation and freezing preserved seal, caribou, and fish through winters that lasted 9 months. These techniques required only sun, wind, smoke, salt, and knowledge. On reservations where power outages were and remain common, where refrigerators failed and were not repaired for months, these preservation methods were not historical curiosities. They were backup systems that worked every time power failed. Secret 8. Medicinal herb gardens. Growing your own healthcare. Cherokee, Navajo, Lakota, Ojibwe. Across every nation, the women who maintained kitchen gardens also maintained medicinal herb plots. Echinacea, yarrow, sage, sweetgrass, Wild ginger. These plants, grown at the edge of the vegetable garden or gathered from nearby land, provided the first line of healthcare for communities where access to formal medical facilities was and remains radically insufficient. On Pine Ridge Reservation, documented in reporting from 2016, residents faced a 48-kilometer drive to reach the nearest town for emergency care. Families who maintained medicinal plant knowledge had healthcare available outside their door. The knowledge was free. The plants were free. The skill to use them correctly was the only investment required. Secret 7. Teaching children to work, labor as family capital. On reservations where unemployment exceeded 50% and where formal employment was structurally scarce, the family unit was the primary economic production unit. Children learned to garden, to preserve food, to hunt, to sew, to build and repair, as young as they were physically capable of contributing. Not as child labor in any exploitative sense, as apprenticeship in the skills that would allow them to survive in conditions where formal employment might never be available. The boarding school system, which forcibly removed Native children from their families between 1869 and the 1970s, was aimed specifically at disrupting this transmission. Remove the children, place them in institutions where they speak English and learn Western trades, sever the intergenerational chain of knowledge. The families who resisted, who kept children home or reclaimed them early, were protecting an economic inheritance more valuable than any trust fund. Secret 6. Bartering with neighbors. Commerce outside the broken system. When the formal economy excludes you, when banks will not lend, when employers will not hire, when the nearest store is 50 miles away, you build your own economy with the people around you. On reservations across the country, informal barter networks operated continuously alongside whatever formal economy existed. A family with laying hens traded eggs for labor. A family with a functioning vehicle traded transportation for food. A skilled repairman fixed a neighbor's generator in exchange for firewood. These exchanges were unrecorded, untaxed, and invisible to every economic measurement that documented reservation poverty. They were also the difference between families getting by and families not getting by. Secret 5. Repair everything. Buy nothing twice. On a reservation where income was chronically insufficient and the nearest hardware store required a long drive, the ability to repair rather than replace was a fundamental economic skill. Vehicles kept running through mechanical ingenuity far past their engineered lifespan. Homes maintained against wind and cold, with materials salvaged from other structures. Tools repaired, sharpened, and rehandled rather than replaced. Clothing mended until the fabric itself gave out. This repair culture was not a choice made from virtue. It was a necessity imposed by poverty. But the skill set it built, the mechanical knowledge, the material understanding, the patience to maintain rather than discard, was genuine economic capital that operated entirely outside the formal marketplace. Secret 4. Collective childcare. Survival without daycare costs. In traditional Native American communities, childcare was a communal function. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, and older children shared responsibility for younger children as a matter of course. This system continued on reservations out of both cultural continuity and economic necessity. Formal childcare is one of the largest household expenses in modern America, averaging between $10,000 and $20,000 per year per child. On a reservation where per capita income might be $8,000 annually, paid childcare was impossible. The collective childcare system, embedded in multi-generational households and extended family networks, made it possible for adults to work, to hunt, to garden, and to pursue income without paying a cost they could not afford. Secret 3. Know the land. Foraging as financial strategy. Every reservation sits on land. That land, however degraded by over a century of federal mismanagement, still produces edible plants, medicinal herbs, and harvestable resources for families who know how to find them. Wild turnips on the northern plains, piñon nuts in the southwest, wild rice in the Great Lakes region, camas root in the Pacific Northwest. These foods, free to anyone with the knowledge to identify and harvest them, supplemented reservation diets in ways that cost nothing. The knowledge of where to find them, when to harvest them, how to prepare them, transmitted from elders to children over generations, was a form of financial knowledge as practical as knowing where the bank was. And unlike the bank, it never turned a Native family away. Secret 2. Sovereignty as the ultimate financial protection. Tribal sovereignty, the legal status of native nations as governments with inherent rights of self-governance, has been under continuous assault since the first treaty was signed in 1778. But it has also been the legal foundation for every economic development initiative that has worked on tribal land. The Oneida Nation in Wisconsin built a casino, a hotel, and manufacturing facilities that created hundreds of jobs for tribal members. The Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma invested in healthcare, roads, and communications infrastructure that measurably improved quality of life for its citizens. These developments were only possible because tribal sovereignty gave nations the legal authority to govern their own economies outside the state regulations that had been used to exclude them. Sovereignty was the only financial protection that the federal government could not simply take away, though it tried repeatedly. The families who understood sovereignty, who organized politically to defend it, were protecting the foundation on which every future economic development would rest. Secret 1. And this secret is today being studied by economists, food policy researchers, and community development specialists across the United States as a model for building economic resilience outside and around systems that exclude. Build your wealth in relationships, not in institutions. Mary Hollow Hornbear on Pine Ridge Reservation in 1934 had no bank account, she had no mortgage, she had no credit history. Between 1991 and 1996, 50 years after Mary's lifetime, only 91 conventional mortgage loans were made to Native Americans on tribal lands nationwide. The banking system was not available to her. The formal economy was designed around her exclusion. What she had instead were relationships, with her neighbors who shared food when hers ran short, with the land that produced food if she knew how to ask it, with elders who taught her how to preserve and store and make last what she had, with her children who would carry that knowledge forward. That network, invisible to every formal economic measurement, appearing in no federal poverty statistic as an asset, was the financial system that kept her family alive through conditions the American government had specifically designed to be unsurvivable. We dismantled our own versions of that network when we decided that institutions were more reliable than people. The families on Pine Ridge are still rebuilding it. The Bring Back the Buffalo campaign on Pine Ridge Reservation aims to restore bison herds, provide meat processing jobs, and return a food system to the community that the federal government destroyed in 40 years of deliberate slaughter between 1870 and 1890. It is taking longer to rebuild than it took to destroy. It always does. But the knowledge of how it worked, the knowledge Mary carried, was never fully erased. It was just waiting to be remembered.